When talking about wealth, especially in America, and as somebody who identifies and is a black man under every description and definition living in this country and living in this world, there's a topic that it's just impossible to talk about wealth without addressing in some capacity. And that is the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is the difference in wealth between white households and households of color, such as Black and Latino households. It's a measure of racial economic inequality and is a key factor when discussing other disparities such as income, health, education, and opportunity. Dr. David B. McMillon is a professor of economics at Emory University who received his PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. The goal of his work can be summarized as using systems thinking to combat systemic discrimination, situated at the intersection of stratification economics substantively and applied theory methodologically. What does this mean? This means that his life's purpose is to understand and solve the problems that have created the racial wealth gap. So if there is anybody worth sitting down to discuss this topic, it is my brother. I am Joshua McMillon, and this is the Rooted in Generational Wealth podcast.
We do look at the racial wealth gap. Yes, there is a gap based on 2019 data. The median wealth of the average white family is about $160,000.
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. When you have a culture that doesn't...
Instead of saying that,
You know what? Explain to me. Explain to me why the black kids are bad. Explain to me why black kids are bad. Explain to me why
Let me first say that it's an honor and a privilege for me to be here with my only younger brother, founder and CEO of Rooted In, business owner, self-made man, former educator with a connecting beard. My name is David McMillon. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Emory University. I've been affiliated with the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. I work with researchers at the Cleveland Fed, also at the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center for Racial Equity, as well as the Stone Center for Research on Wealth Inequality under my mentor, Stephen Durloff. So that's what I would say as a starting point.
That's a great start. The racial wealth gap.
Yep, that thing.
That's definitely something that I think is important to discuss, just based on its historical significance. We as African American men that have had the privilege, if you will, of experiencing a family that did what they could to overcome, right, some of the barriers that have naturally been put in place, historically speaking. But I think it's important to have a discussion so that others know why we are here in the space that we're in America, just in total. So could you speak to what is the racial wealth gap from your perspective?
Yeah, I can start with that. The racial wealth gap, there are many different ways to measure it, but what economists generally refer to is at the median, so the middle point in the distribution. What is the median black wealth compared to median white wealth? And so the ratio of white to black wealth has been estimated to be anywhere between 6-to-1 and 10-to-1, depending on the data source that you use. And so that's to say that for every dollar that black people have in terms of their net wealth, white Americans have $6 to $10. It's really enormous, and that's just at the median. The gap is measured differently if you focus on people sort of at the top 1% and at the very bottom, but traditionally people often just refer to the median. You also mentioned our family, and I do want to say something about that really quick. Our grandfather, right, rest in peace, Joe McMillon.
Absolutely.
He was very proud of what he was able to make of himself, right? He had like 3 different careers, always trying to work and save. Retired, command sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank, right? But he told me, right, that his father was actually a slave, right? Grant McMillon Sr. And so he really, there's a kind of a literal sense in which he really came from nothing. And so the American dream is kind of about, well, even though you start with this very little, maybe over time we can, achieve more social mobility, right? And like you said, we've been privileged in certain ways. Dad eventually became a pastor, and then and mom is tremendous in lots of different ways. They were great parents, and then we had access to all these opportunities. But when Grandpa passed away, I won't say how much he had. It was very little to have been someone who was working so hard for so long. So one thing that we think about when we study the racial wealth gap is just simply how vast it is, and how even someone who really does everything they're allegedly supposed to do in terms of working and saving can really end up in a situation where you can sort of barely afford to die, right? The funeral costs a lot of money. You got to spend money on other people who you're leaving behind. So we can get into that, but I just wanted to bring that up in terms of our own story.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. That's a super good start.
Yeah.
So can you share what inspired you to focus on the racial wealth gap as far as your instruction and such of that nature?
I see. I mean, so that's in terms of my research story. That's a pretty long story. To keep that part kind of short, I would say that initially, I was into just like math and physics. I was into hard sciences and things like that in high school and college, and I sort of had a moment where I realized that the tools that I had learned could be applied to social justice issues. What essentially happened was I was with mom and dad at they go to Alex Haley's farm for like this conference every year. They were going. Yeah. They put these people who wanted to be leaders in their community, right, in one room after discussing the issue of mass incarceration. They closed the door and then just said, all right, we need you guys to solve the problem. We've been spending all this time talking about how extensive mass incarceration is, disparities in arrest rates and things like that. We need you to solve the problem. And you had all these different people arguing. Some people wanted, well, we need to focus on education. Others, we need to focus on sentencing disparities. We need black people to be more involved in politics. We need to change funding for black-owned businesses. All these different ideas. And it was in that moment that I realized that my training in this field called complex systems theory could actually be used to try to take into account multiple perspectives that were fundamentally interrelated, to try to understand conditions under which it made sense to focus on one kind of investment versus another. So anyway, I know I made this longer than I intended to, but basically the reason I stumbled upon thinking about the racial wealth gap is, initially I was thinking about, how do we deal with these incarceration issues? And I did a study that basically showed, pretty much prevention is the best cure, right? So even if you eliminate, disparities in terms of arrest rates and things like that, the fact of the matter is that just initial participation in crime is a very, very big deal. That's like a sensitive piece of the puzzle. And so mom is absolutely right when she says we really need to focus on education. But then during my PhD at UChicago, I spent all this time thinking about all the research on how do we improve schools, for everyone, but then, particularly for like black and brown kids who are disadvantaged. And there are lots of ideas out there, but I'm telling you, when it comes down to it, every idea costs money. Segregation is a real thing. It costs money to live in higher quality neighborhoods. The kids who have wealthier, more educated parents are at a tremendous advantage. We experienced this at SASA, right? And so ultimately I realized eventually all of these different things that people really care about in terms of making sure people can live lives of decency, it's all connected to wealth. It is all connected to wealth. It's not to say that if you don't have money, you can't become anything, right? That's not what we're saying. But fundamentally, wealth really is connected to all of these things.
Now, when you're saying wealth, are we talking about strictly wealth in the definition of finances? Like how much money is passed down over time?
Okay. So the way that I define wealth, the way economists generally define wealth, is just total net worth. So it's your total assets minus your liabilities at any given time. Now, the amount of wealth that someone has can change over time, right, as the value of your assets increase or value of liabilities increase. But I do mean total wealth, and not just liquid wealth, the amount that you can easily access in a bank, but the total amount of net worth you have. Maybe some of it is invested in a car, some of it is invested in crypto, whatever it is.
Properties, different things like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
That is what I refer to when I'm talking about the racial wealth gap, when I say how important all these things are connected to wealth.
So it might not be a thing where there are certain families who pass down a ton of money, but there's also a possibility in which maybe there was at least a home that could be passed down from one generation to the next. That is a transfer of wealth.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. There are a lot of transfers of wealth across generations that people don't even think about. And this is actually a problem in the data as well. So it's one thing to say that someone literally hands you a gift. So maybe while your grandparents are still alive, they just give you a bunch of money, right? Those are called in vivo transfers. And so that's a raw amount of money. Also, it could just be a gift. It could be a car. All these things become a part of your wealth portfolio, right? At the same time, someone can pass down a business, right? That has a value. It has a value at a given time, but also it has potential to create more value in the future. And of course, like you said, a house. There are a lot of families where, maybe your grandparents pass away and then you inherit the house. If the house is paid off, the house is worth $200,000, you literally have $200,000 more dollars, in the sense that you can just sell it right on the market. So all of those things matter for sure. And we'll get into maybe some of this a bit later, but the inequality in housing is a huge driver of the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good segue, because when I was thinking about the racial wealth gap and the fact that you said it's not just transferring finances over, right? Just from a historical perspective, if we could just highlight some of the past that America kind of doesn't speak on like that, redlining, GI Bill, different things that impacted the ability for Black Americans to be able to gain wealth over generations. If you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and we're actually about to cover this stuff actually on Wednesday for my class, teach a freshman seminar on this called The Economics of Systemic Racism. Now, We'll come back to slavery at some point. One thing that I want to say, that I want to emphasize here, is that people think that when a lot of time goes by, that history doesn't really matter anymore. And that's just not the way that wealth works, right? In the first place, wealth can be passed down multiple generations, right? But also, things that create wealth, right, can be passed down multiple generations. And the government actually explicitly generated segregation. What I was taught in school, and I think we had some of the same teachers, and I'm not even blaming them because I think they were probably taught something similar. What a lot of us were taught is that there's de jure segregation and there's de facto segregation, right? There was a period where, yes, the government was explicitly racist in terms of housing policies, but then after that, The reason that we still see segregation today is just because people kind of prefer to live near people who are like them.
Okay, which is which for that?
De jure being of the law, de facto being, after we supposedly resolved this stuff with the civil rights movement, in more modern times, segregation just kind of accidentally emerged. That's the idea.
Okay.
So that stuff is not true. Richard Rothstein talks about this in his book, The Color of Law, which I have my students read. Public housing actually did not start. It was not for black people, even though it has this affiliation. In people's minds, it has this stereotype of being associated with the stereotypical welfare queen and things like that. Some of these racist tropes. Public housing started in America for middle class people. During the Great Depression, poor people, including poor white people, were not allowed access to public housing. And public housing was initially put into place because there was a housing shortage, and there were people who could afford to pay it, middle class people. And so it was so public housing was built for them. And so then they move in, right? Now around this time, World War II is going on, right? And so you have this massive demand for really just to feed more into industrialization. We've got to build planes, we've got to build ships, we've got to support this war effort. And so black and white families are now taking up these kinds of jobs. And so the government builds public housing that's higher quality for white people. And for black people, the intentional idea was to ensure that this was only a temporary situation for black people. So they built lower quality housing in areas that they knew were dangerous, right? Places where there's higher pollution, places near train tracks, right? Like we have right outside the church. And so you have this immediate intentional disparity that's built in, right? And so what happened over time is that the demand increased for the black housing and actually started decreasing for the white public housing. So in the same city, you have this major shortage in public housing in terms of what white people were allowed access to. But then there's this higher demand in terms of black public housing. It's all segregated. And so what people started to realize, and what I'm going to reemphasize throughout this interview, hopefully, is that racism is actually economically inefficient. It creates market failures. And so the government realized that this was not sustainable, so they opened public housing to black people to fill in those vacancies. You follow me so far?
Yes. Now, can you describe what a market failure is for the listeners?
Absolutely. A market failure in economics, say you take Econ 101, it's basically, there's this idea that if markets are perfect and sellers are able to sell at the appropriate price and buyers are able to buy in terms of their willingness to pay at an appropriate price, then the market should be efficient in the sense that there shouldn't be any opportunity for someone else to come in and sort of make money. It's called arbitrage, sort of make money off of a problem in the market. I'll bring up another historical example of that in a bit. But essentially, there's an inefficiency and it hurts the economy essentially, right? And so they opened up public housing to black people, right? And so around this time, industry leaves those cities, and that hits black families very, very hard. And so the quality of the housing goes down, the upkeep goes down. They can no longer afford to pay the housing prices. And so now those gradually turn into the slums that we see today. Okay, this was not, the so-called ghettos were not put in place by accident. They are absolutely not accidents. And so people need to understand that, but that's not something that we're taught in schools. That is also intentional. We'll get into that. On the other hand, the situation for white families changed. There was massive government funding to subsidize housing for white families in suburban areas. And initially, that seemed like a crazy idea. We weren't a suburban, country like that. But eventually, white families, moved into these suburban areas, and they were able to buy these houses for very cheap because it was subsidized by the government. People talk about, free handouts. Free handouts have happened so many times throughout history in a discriminatory way, and this is one of the big ones. The subsidization, government subsidizing white suburban housing in the mid 20th century, which then, right? So you buy a house then for $9,000, $10,000. What happens to the value of that house over a period of time, right? And what we know happened is that the values of those houses increased tremendously. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so then that adds to your wealth. You're able to pass that wealth down to your kids. You're able to invest in in private tutoring, have access to these quality schools, so that your kids are now able to, with higher skills, able to have higher incomes and pass more wealth to their kids. Right? So it's moving. You see these things that happened in the mid 20th century. Whatever the long-term results of slavery already were going to be, these things that happened in terms of housing intentionally increased the racial wealth gaps beyond what they already were, right? So the racial wealth gap we see today is not an accident.
Okay. Going back to one of the things that you said, and I've heard this argument before when speaking about the racial wealth gap, when speaking about segregation and the fact that there are racial groups that live near each other. I've heard the argument that is just due to tribalism. And let's say, for instance, at a school, all the black kids hang around black kids, all the white kids hang around white kids. These are similar things that happen just on a societal level. You leave school, you go into a community, all black people are near black people, or white people are near white people in a general sense. How much of this do you believe is actually just on a historical level, the discrimination that was implemented by our government? How much of this do you think is tribalism, that is explaining possibly why black people may not have figured things out, pick themselves up by their bootstraps? I'm sure you've heard certain verbiage like this.
Naturally.
Yeah, versus the things that you're speaking towards.
So that's a great question. And I'm going to answer it like this. In my view, I think some people might try to answer that, to think of it as an empirical question, that you can design a study and try to separate, the extent to which it's due to this tribalism idea versus what I'm referring to, these historical facts. But the reality is that these two things are fundamentally interrelated, right?
Yeah.
For example, take redlining, right? Even if it were initially the case that the racial wealth gap was non-existent, suppose, right, like in the early 20th century, somehow we had closed the racial wealth gap, right? And there's really no difference between black and white people across these economic outcomes. Once you introduce redlining, what you're doing is you're creating this notion in people's heads that if you own a house in this area that's predominantly black, your housing value may decrease. And if you own a house in this area that's predominantly white, the opposite might happen. And so if you, just by that notion existing in someone's head, that's going to, drive up demand for the white housing market and decrease demand in the black housing market. So what happens next is because of these initial beliefs and this government policy, you will endogenously create this like more of a racial wealth gap. So what happens after that? Well, now that there's more of a gap, think about all the things that wealth is associated with. If you have less, if you're struggling more and you need to eat somehow, right? We have all of this evidence that those kinds of things are connected to increased crime rates, right? People do commit more of at least certain kinds of crimes when they have significantly less. At the same time, it will be harder to get a quality education for all kinds of reasons, right? You can work as hard as you want. The highest, quality teachers will understand that they're high quality teachers and will desire to get paid at a better school. I mean, you've been a teacher. I'm sure you've been subject to these kinds of ideas.
Not the best price point for hiring. Yeah, that's a fact.
And so, people will point fingers. They'll blame the teachers or they'll blame the parents, and there's all these different things. They'll blame these different components of what is really a complex system of factors. And so, the point that I was trying to get at in saying all that is, so then you end up with a situation where people are adapting these behaviors that people might stereotypically today associate with blackness, but really is the way human beings in general respond when there's some level of destitution, right? And so I said all that to say that these government policies that I'm referring to, they very much were partly responsible for creating the stereotypes that people now associate with black people, right? And it could have been it could have happened with any group, right? You cause harm to some kind of group, that's going to have ripple effects, and it could actually affect not only how you view them culturally, it could also affect them culturally as well, right? So it's not necessarily even productive to try to think, well, how much of it is just, people just naturally want to live not near people who don't look like them, right? The reason that you might not want to live near someone who looks like that, it could have been because of a lie that you were told, or it could have been because of the economic situation of those people that was derived from these government policies, what I'm saying.
Gotcha. So there's a clear economic impact that has affected black people over time, for sure. Thank you for speaking to that. I want to pivot into slavery. You said we were going to talk about that.
Yeah.
And also, if there is anything, I'm not sure. I know we're speaking in econ, but I'm thinking of just like the psychological manipulation that happened over the years as well. I'm thinking of the Willie Lynch theory. I'm thinking of how mass media used cartoons, animation, over embellished caricatures of blackness to further cement the idea of what it means to be black and how black people should identify themselves. If we could just start from slavery, speak more to that racial wealth gap as well, but just like if there was anything that you noticed that impacted black people economically based on psychological manipulation.
If you don't mind, I actually, that's a great question, so I'm going to answer that, and I want to answer it by winding the clocks even further back, because I think this is how I start my class when I teach it. We start by just discussing the origins of the concept of race, because a lot of people don't realize that it's kind of a very new invention in the course of human history. Humans have been around for modern humans, 120 to 200,000 years or something like that at the most. And so for the vast majority of human history, this idea of race was not really a thing. There is evidence, and this is one of my favorite theories, but essentially there is evidence that there was an extinction level event that human beings faced about 70,000 years ago, and it's called the Mount Tobo eruption. And essentially, if you wind the clocks back, you notice that human beings that existed before then had a lot more genetic variation than they did after this event, right? Which suggests that there were a ton of people who really just died off, and barely, maybe like a few thousand people were left. The reason that matters is that essentially pretty much everyone who's alive today is descended from a very small group of incredibly intelligent, imaginative black people. All of them, of every race. And so that means that we're not just similar genetically, we're remarkably similar, like strangely similar, even compared to other species. It's called a genetic bottleneck. So I introduced my students to that theory in part to dispel these ideas that have become more popular and sort of on the dark web, but started with sort of people like Thomas Jefferson, that somehow black people are genetically less intelligent. And so we're actually very, very similar. Okay, so then this idea of race emerges way later. I mean, there have been multiple civilizations, like in the Fertile Crescent, that were all very what we would call today racially diverse. We've lived in integrated societies for most of human history. We've had all kinds of integrated societies, but then colonialism starts, and you have these Europeans who are very exploitative, who are trying to travel to these different lands and take advantage of the indigenous people who are living there, and eventually see a need for to make labor as free as possible, right? And so that becomes the rise eventually of chattel slavery. You asked me to speak to the psychological manipulation, so I'm getting there in just a second. And so it really starts with colonialism, this idea of race. Basically, people are manipulating themselves, right? You had this idea of enlightenment, of Christianity basically meaning, well, we need to be more enlightened, we need to treat other people equally, right? So the only way you can have that idea coexist with the institution of chattel slavery is to view the enslaved as not human. Because if they're humans, we have to treat them equally, right? But if they're not human, then maybe it's okay, right? So chattel slavery is a word derived from cattle. So now what you're doing is you're treating them like cattle, and you're actually breeding them, and the enslaved status of the father is passed down to the son, and so you have perpetual slavery.
3/5 of a man.
Right, and so you what happens is that people are manipulating themselves into believing that this is okay. They're deciding that they want to do this, right? Because there are enormous economic benefits, of course, of free labor. I mean, so much so that within less than 200 years, this colony is able to stand against the most powerful empire in the world, the British Empire, right? That happened in large part because your economy is able to grow very quickly due to this free labor. All right. So the first thing I was trying to say is that people manipulated themselves into believing that this is okay. But then you get, Thomas Jefferson signs the Declaration of Independence. The Revolutionary War happens. By the way, black people would have been freed sooner under British rule because Britain did free their slaves first. Okay, that's one of the
fun fact.
Fun fact. It's one of the reasons people just don't feel all that excited about the 4th of July. Anyway,
distasteful.
But also the British Empire, so they actually gave reparations to the slave masters. I found that out like a year ago. I didn't. It's hard to even wrap your mind around that. I see how you're looking right now. That's how I was feeling. So it's not just not giving reparations to the enslaved, but it's giving reparations to the people who were already enslaving them. And they didn't stop paying that off until 2015, that loan. All right, so that's an aside. Unfortunately,
hold on, 2015?
Yeah, 2015. I know.
Oh man, that's tough. That's a tough pill to swallow.
Stuff, a lot of this stuff I really didn't learn until like after I became a professor and started teaching this class. I was learning like math and stuff during my grad school years. Like this stuff was all like, all right.
Okay, wait, the 2015, just quick side on this, because this is crazy. So does this mean by 2015 that the reparations were finally paid off? Or does it mean at 2015 they were like, you know what?
We should
probably stop. Like which?
Sadly, they were fully paid off.
Oh my
they had paid the banks back who had paid off the slave masters, right? Okay. Now, what that also means, I know we're focused on America, but since we talk about Britain, which they've got a lot of stuff.
It was a
going on
crazy
historically.
stat. I'm sorry, bro. It was too wild. That was too wild. 2015 is okay.
But if you think about it, what that also means is like if you did think about like in terms of justice, like if you were to distribute reparations for reparations like in the British context, you would have to do it twice. Right? Because like it's one thing to just not give reparations to the enslaved. It's another thing to also give reparations to the people who were exploiting them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so from a certain moral standpoint, one might think that should be paid off and given to anyway.
Yeah.
So that's them.
Let's go back to slavery.
Yeah, good old slave.
It's a lighter topic.
Somehow,
I feel better.
Somehow it's a lighter topic. So Thomas Jefferson. Oh yeah. Thomas Jefferson signs the Declaration of Independence. George Washington becomes the first president. By this time, chattel slavery is really taking off. I should also mention, by the way, you were talking about psychological manipulation. I have to bring this up. I have to go back. Bacon's Rebellion happens like around the 1670s or 80s. Have you ever heard of that? Mm-mm. All right. So before then, there was sort of like there was really indentured servitude, right? And so you actually had a situation where poor black and white people were kind of on relatively equal footing.
Okay, I know this era,
right? And so it's this strange era where like, but there's still classism. And so what happens is, I believe there's an uprising against one of the governors. I want to say the governor of Virginia. And so these poor white and poor black people came together and stood against what they viewed as a common enemy, which were the wealthy, powerful elite, right, regardless of race. And so that was Bacon's Rebellion. And so as a result of that, essentially the argument that some historians make is that there was an idea that was invented to convince the poor white people that they are different from the poor black people, right? You may be poor, but at least you're not black, right? And at the same time, sort of inventing this racial hierarchy idea with indigenous and black people at the very bottom, white people at the very top, and other kinds of brown people somewhere in the middle. And so the idea is that was psychological manipulation, one of the most important kinds of psychological manipulation that laid the foundations of the country, and many would argue still exists today. Some would argue you saw some of that stuff happening with Trump and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I was just about to say, definitely there's remnants there.
Yeah.
From what you've said based on that, because usually when we're talking about socioeconomic status and blatant racism, people being racist to your face, it doesn't come in the form of, say, someone in a company or corporation who's well paid. They're not going to just outright say something racist to your face. But when you start talking about the origins of the KKK, which comes from Michigan, the state that we live in, right? It's not necessarily coming from the top richest 1% that are located elsewhere. So, yeah, man, that actually aligns, makes total sense, unfortunately, but also, it's a reality.
I mean, it's unfortunate for a lot of different reasons, of course. But so William Darity talks about this in his book, From Here to Equality, where, part of what he's doing in that book is he's dispelling a lot of myths. One that, basically most white Americans, families, most white Americans, I should say, did not own slaves, right? And so he's basically arguing, one thing that he's arguing is that, yes, but that doesn't mean, right, that they were not committing acts of racial terror or in various ways benefiting from the institution of slavery. And so he's also outlining how a lot of poor white people at the time were manipulated in the way that I just described. Now, with that said, racism was very much, there was kind of a united front, right, across economic class against black people. But I wanted to make sure that I made another point here. Essentially, so Thomas Jefferson became president, and he also wrote so he's a famous inventor. He was president. He was author of the Declaration of Independence. So he was very celebrated, right, historically. But one thing that people don't discuss about him very much, and it's basically, I guess, been outlawed in certain southern states to talk about some of this stuff. But he published this book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And when I found out about this, it really hit me because I was an admirer of Thomas Jefferson because of the way that I was taught about him, right? So Notes on the State of Virginia, among other things, one thing that he did in that book is he had these musings about just tried to make meaning out of what he saw, right, among enslaved black people versus white people that he knew. He had been raised, by black people, right, and white people, right? And a slave woman used to carry him when he was a baby, right? And so he'd been around them all his life. But what he observed in his mind is, well, these people they're less intelligent. They don't read very well. They don't have a very good vocabulary, right? Mind you, they're explicitly barred from learning how to read, right? Yeah. And he knows that. But he says these things. He's observing these differences. And he's saying, well, I'm not saying this is definitely true. He's playing these games in his head, these intellectual games. But it seems like the evidence is suggesting that they are somehow, intellectually inferior in some way. And so even though his language is sort of indirect in the book as he's describing this stuff, because he was such a well-respected intellectual, that idea spread across the country and swept the country. If he says it, then it's probably true. It would be like if Albert Einstein started saying something like that.
Yeah.
And so people started believing it. So he's one of, in some sense, he's one of the people who gave rise to these ideas of black intellectual inferiority. And that is another form of manipulation in the sense that it's sort of got stuck in the subconscious of people that maybe black people on some level are just kind of lazy and intellectually inferior. But the truth is, it's a logical flaw, right? And in economics, we would call it omitted variable bias. There are other factors that explain the disparity that you're describing, not the causal variable that you think it is, right? I just talked to you about how, genetically speaking, we are very much the same, right? But in his mind, well, it's probably there's some racial genetic thing going on that distinguishes white people fundamentally from black people. And that has had very long-term effects.
Yeah, I've definitely heard in other podcast spaces the assertion that the black median IQ is lower than the white median IQ.
It is.
And, how do you deal with that? What's up with that? Is that based upon genetics? People don't necessarily want to say that because then you're implying some level of genetic superiority, that you're easily leaning into the rabbit hole of white supremacy at that point. Yeah. But they say that as a one-off, and then keep on. And then kind of keep it moving, or like, I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what to deal with this fact, this data. And it sounds like that means that this assertion's been happening for hundreds of years. Then
yes, that's the thing,
it's
Josh.
Just a recent thing.
It's you see it maybe on the dark web. You see it in people having debates, but the truth is that these, like, if people know their history, Dad just said this to me today, like after his sermon. If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Boy, is this a scary example of that. The fact that people don't know that these tropes, like, we're really around, and not just around, but intellectualized by a very smart person. Say what you want about Thomas Jefferson. He was very smart, right? But he made intellectual mistakes too. And this one was very costly. So, this idea in terms of, racial gaps in IQ, there are lots of issues with IQ. as a metric. It's been improved a lot. Racial gaps in IQ have decreased significantly, like in the last 30 years. There are I could get into a whole rabbit hole about research on that, but essentially there are some studies that show that those gaps can disappear under certain conditions, right? You expose people, you control for certain kinds of really important variables that have to do with what kids are exposed to when they're very young. And basically the younger you go, the gaps pretty much disappear, suggesting that this is not something that's traced back to a genetic thing, but it emerges from the environmental factors that we put people through very early on. And don't get me started on what early childhood education can do, pre-K. I mean, that destroys racial gaps in all kinds of things. I mean, crime, arrests, income, so much. So anyway, we can talk about that. But
all right, let's pause for a second. We are at we're making good time. We're at 45 minutes. I just want to make sure that these are ran properly. I don't want to do the whole podcast and then like, oh yeah, I deleted the
oh dang, it was off.
All right, so you just got finished talking about how early childhood education, doing that properly is a solution that helps lower the difference in IQ between black people, white people over time. We're a solutions-oriented family.
That's
like
right.
I like talking about problems, but for me, if I'm not doing something to fix the thing,
that's right,
then I feel like I only did about 10% of the work, right?
We're not just complaining.
Yeah. So let's talk about some solutions for the racial wealth gap. What are some things that you believe could help solve this systemic issue?
Okay, let me frame the conversation like this. There are lots of things that have been proposed to address the racial wealth gap, because there are a lot of factors that contribute to it, right? On some level, each of these things would help, right, to some degree. But there are many, many factors, and they're interrelated. And so I'm briefly going to describe a study to you that pretty much argues that the only way you're going to close it in the human lifetime is through reparations. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that can be done.
All right, man. This is hot button topic, man. Hold on.
Well, let me. You know what? All right,
we gotta keep the listeners.
We'll ease into this.
Not Here's the R word.
Yeah. Well, forget what I said.
The hard R. Wait.
Let's ease
I'm gonna
into this.
I'm gonna listen. We'll listen. Listen. Stay with us.
Some people argue, right, that that the problem is education.
When you do look at the racial wealth gap, yes, there is a gap. Based on 2019 data, the median wealth of the average white family is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of the average black family. But take into account just two other factors: family structure and education. The median wealth of the average married, college-educated black family is about $160,000 more than the median wealth of an average single-parent white family. So perhaps there are factors beyond just race that, if we were being honest in this conversation, we could collectively tackle and come up with solutions. If the narrative for which you obtain and maintain power is based on this idea of a victimized community, then you have a perverse incentive to ignore all of this and just say that America is inherently racist and oppressive.
So here's the thing about that. And I'm going to be citing primarily a study by William Darity through the Sam Du Bois Cook Center, right? So essentially, the amount of wealth that that the median white American has who didn't even graduate from high school is greater than the amount of wealth that a black American has who graduated from college. You understand what I'm saying here? So at every level of education, white Americans have significantly more wealth than black Americans. Okay, and so if you just control for education, essentially, that is not going to come to, it's not going to even come close to closing the racial wealth gap, okay? So that's the first thing. Now, that doesn't mean that education doesn't help, okay? I just described to you, one way that education helps. Man, education does all kinds of amazing things. Again, it lowers crime rates, it lowers racial disparities and arrest rates and incarceration rates, closes IQ gaps, improves income. It does all kinds of amazing things. Education is essential. But if you think that just closing the education gap is going to get rid of the wealth gap, especially in human lifetime, absolutely not. Okay? No serious economist who thinks about these creates these sophisticated models really think that. And there are other reasons that I won't even get into. But basically, if everyone has access to education, that will also decrease what's called the college premium. So the amount of extra income you get from getting a college education, right? Because if everyone has it, then in some sense the value of it goes down. But that's a different thing. All right, so if education isn't like the silver bullet, then what is? Well, some people argue, there are these cultural issues,
because it has
right?
nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't, you know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened.
There's this financial literacy thing. We need to stop buying Jordans and whatever the racial stereotype
If
is,
you
right?
change one thing, if people simply said, I love my family as much as I love my car, and that means I will invest the same amount in my family as I invest in my car note, do you know that would literally close the racial wealth gap by a tremendous amount? Did y'all know that?
The average black woman is more likely to own a luxury vehicle than the average white woman, despite the fact that the average black family has 1/10 the wealth. Spending patterns on jewelry and expensive clothes are very different in the black community. This is not, I'm not...
Right, I know you're not making an ethical judgment.
Right, I'm not finger wagging at people saying do X, don't do Y. I'm saying there are entire books written by respected left-wing scholars about issues like wealth or income that just don't mention a single one of these
Yeah,
facts.
that Dave Chappelle episode where
Yeah, exactly.
we got reparations and they
Just
spent
gambled it away.
Spent it all on BS. Yeah, man.
So the truth is, there are a number of studies that dispel a lot of those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are myths. When you take a closer look at the data, they don't necessarily hold up. So there are studies that argue that when income is controlled, that black people actually save a bit more than white people. Studies that show that black people actually invest more in their children's education than comparable white Americans, right? This goes against the idea that black people don't value education, for instance. But in terms of financial literacy, one has to realize that at some level, if you have a certain amount of wealth and your plan is to make some set of investments that increase your wealth, what's really going to help more than anything else is having wealth in the first place. You can't even have, if basically even the diversification of a portfolio is associated with already having more wealth in the first place. Some people will criticize black Americans for having too much of their wealth concentrated in housing and not enough spread across different stocks and things like that. But regardless of race, what happens when people accumulate wealth, the first major, asset that's purchased is a house, right? Regardless of race. And then as you make more money, the portfolio diversifies, okay? So it's what is actually true is that wealth leads to, the capacity to even make smart financial decisions, if that makes sense, right? And so that's something that needs to be emphasized a lot more. eventually, once you realize that the wealth gap is like between 6 to 1 and 10 to 1, you also have to understand that you could make very, very smart investment decisions that give you significantly higher returns than white Americans. But I'm going to describe a study in a bit that basically showed even under totally optimal conditions, it would take more than 200 years to close the gap. Okay? We'll get there in a second. Some people... Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it's a crazy stat. You went straight to the punchline. That's
yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to motivate it because this is. I am not trying to say that financial literacy is not important. Of course, it's important. If there is a cultural issue, culture matters. If there's a lack of education, that matters. All of these things matter, right? But what's also true is that wealth affects all of these things, right? So if you're trying to use these things as a solution to wealth, when in the first place, wealth is a causal factor that creates some of these things, we have to think about that.
I'm rocking with you.
Okay.
All right. So, could you keep speaking to the research that you said it would
you want to get to the study. Okay,
yeah,
we can do it.
It's going to take... how many generations is that?
All right, look.
Yeah.
This is my good friend and colleague, Laura Durencourt. She's a rock star economist at Princeton, and so she has this paper, the Wealth of Two Nations, right? And she put together this incredible data set that keeps track of black and white wealth, starting from right around the Emancipation Proclamation into basically modern times, something like 2020. She had to put together a lot of different data sets to make this happen. She creates kind of like a time series, and so here's what she finds. She finds that the wealth gap, I want to say, was like almost 60 to 1 just before the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Meaning white people had $60 for every $1 that black people had. That makes sense because black bodies are literally part of the portfolio of white people, right? At that point, a lot of their wealth was literally the bodies of slaves. So then the Emancipation Proclamation happens. It drops to 20 to 1, which is still huge. And then it continues to drop until right around the mid-20th century, around the time all those things I told you about in terms of housing were happening. And then, if anything, it stopped going down. If anything, it sort of opened back up in recent years after the 2008 housing crisis and COVID-19 and things like that. So the question is, what's going on? What's going on? And to your question, how do we fix it? Okay, here's what she does. She puts together this model, and it's a relatively simple model, but essentially she keeps track in this model of how wealth accumulates over time. She thinks about capital gains. So capital gains is the return you get if you invest your money basically on the stock market or something like that. Okay. She keeps track of what's called the rate of return if you just left your money in the bank essentially. She keeps track of the growth rate of income and like a couple other things, including the savings rate, right? So the savings rate would be involved in like some of these cultural stereotypes that people make about black people. Oh, we don't know how to save money. We spend our money on clothes, all those kinds of things, all right? So what does she find? She runs a number of different simulations, and she shows that even when you equalize the savings rate, so turn off all those cultural stereotypes, okay? Even though there's research that goes against them, let's say you believe them. Let's say tomorrow we're just going to focus on making black people spend money in a smarter, more responsible way. All right, to the point where it's the same as white people. Do the same thing with the capital gains rate, okay? The returns on the stock market. Equalize all these different things, right? What she finds is even under those ideal conditions where we focus on everything except reparations, it still takes more than 200 years before the racial wealth gap has actually completely closed. And there's actually a there's another paper too, and it's under revision right now. But basically, they find something similar. Okay, that it would take more than 200 years, and so this is troubling, right? Because this suggests that the things that we usually turn to try to address the racial wealth gap, whatever it is, education, try to focus on closing the income gap or financial literacy, all those things. It kind of suggests that even if we did all those things in an optimal way, it would still take a very long time. But that shouldn't surprise us. Slavery lasted a long time. What, are we surprised that it would have really long-term effects that take a long time to reverse? You know what we did to people during slavery? And after slavery was abolished, what we did after, which was worse, because now we were no longer property, so we didn't have the protections afforded property. All of the times throughout history where we still rose up despite the things that were against us and created wealthy communities, because we did do that many times. And then the Tulsa Massacre happens. Right. So massive handouts, including the Homestead Act, right, to people who are not us, but things being taken away from us. And we're surprised. We've been doing this, we've continued to do this for at least 7/8 of America's history. And now in the last 50 years, we're like, what's taking so long?
Things should be fixed by now.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
it's absurd, especially when right now in the current election, we're barely able to even make progress on, we can't even teach what has happened to black people in schools. We can't even tell the truth about what has happened. So we're definitely a far cry from actually trying to rectify the long-term effects of history, which are real and have been proven. So if we're not doing any of that, why would we think that we would reach equity in any kind of reasonable time frame? Now, what she shows in that paper is that reparations for slavery and Jim Crow through cash transfers or baby bonds is the only way to close the racial wealth gap within a human lifetime, something like 30 years. Okay? She doesn't, she's not able to prove whether or not the racial wealth gap will open back up after reparations have been dispensed. But then that gets into my research, which isn't finished yet. But I'm working on a few papers that are basically trying to, understand the conditions under which reparations, once closing the racial wealth gap, would keep the racial wealth gap closed.
Okay.
So,
nice. So could you speak to some of that research so that we can work on this, and if the racial wealth gap is closed, we have an idea for how to keep it closed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so like I said, my research is still ongoing, but I'll give you like a couple of ideas.
Okay.
So a lot of the work that economists have done on reparations, frequently argues that once reparations is dispensed and the racial wealth gap closes, that it's going to reopen. And they argue this for different reasons. What all these papers have in common is that they don't essentially endogenize how wealth is related to the mechanism that they're studying. So let me just give a couple examples of that. So some people basically argue that the racial wealth gap will reopen once it's closed, basically because wealth is like this they create these models where wealth is kind of like a transient thing. There's nothing in their models that really allow wealth to spill back over into income. Let me simplify it by saying this. What I'm arguing is that economists already understand that wealth leads to more wealth for 1,000 reasons. Wealth leads to more wealth because once you buy a house, right, you no longer have to pay rent. That presumably the housing value of the house can go up and so on. Wealth leads to more wealth across generations because once I have more wealth, I can move to a high-quality neighborhood that has amenities that are conducive to the production of human capital, meaning my kids will become more skilled adults and have higher income, higher wealth. Higher wealth is associated, therefore, also with the kinds of neighborhoods that don't have, higher crime rates and those kinds of things. Wealth is associated with owning a successful business, because it's not that black people are afraid to start businesses, but we frequently don't have the initial capital required. Yeah. And so once you get that capital, it's much easier to get the business going, then make more wealth. So for so many reasons, economists understand that wealth leads to more wealth. But for some strange reason that I don't fully understand, economists frequently fail to take that into account when they're studying the potential effects of reparations. What happens when you give black people reparations? Wealth leads to more wealth for a lot of different reasons. So even if there's some extent to which, people may spend money in some suboptimal way, some of that money still gets invested in your kids' education. Some of that money still gets invested maybe in some black-owned business, right? Some of that money gets invested eventually in a house. And you know what the amount for reparations is estimated at from William Darity's perspective?
Not at all.
Something around like $250,000.
For each individual.
African-American. Not household, but per capita. Okay, this is not a bag of Skittles. This is $250,000.
It's a lot of money.
You can immediately own a home.
Yeah. You can immediately own a business.
You can immediately own a business. You can immediately not have to pay rent anymore. All right, so these are, okay. So basically, a lot of my work can be summarized as trying to think about these different feedback loops through wealth leads to more wealth, and actually trying to estimate the strength of those feedback loops to simulate the extent to which reparations will be able to have long-term effects on the racial wealth gap. And, I'll give you one more example. If we, say we wanted to do a study on reparations, and we wanted to just ask, how will black folks, spend money if they're given a bunch of money? One thing we could do is we could conduct an experiment where we randomly assign $250,000 to a bunch of black people that are in these different communities, right? We could randomize that intervention. It's some black people, a black person in Saginaw gets it, a black person in Flint gets it, and just spread it across the nation essentially, and compare them to the people in the control group and see how how their wealth does after a period of time. One thing that I argue is that that's a bad idea, right? That's going to lead to a situation where you underestimate the effect of reparations, because reparations is not simply giving money to a bunch of isolated individuals. If you were to give money to just an isolated individual, now I'm in a otherwise potentially broken community. What's the first thing that's going to happen?
Everyone's going to ask you for money.
Okay?
Yeah.
Everyone's going to ask you for money, right? And so now it may look like I'm not spending my money well. It may look like, the effects of reparations are fading out over time. You see this with all these different people because you've given this intervention in these isolated, broken communities to these different people that are not interacting, okay? Now, what is more reflective of the real situation? In the real situation, everybody gets it, right? All of these, they're different conditions, but a bunch of black folks
yeah.
get reparations simultaneously, including black folks that live in the same communities. So if I get it and you get it, if everybody in our family gets this, let's just start with the family. Let's say Morgan, for instance. Let's say Morgan just he blows it off. Let's say he loses all the money somehow. What's going to happen? Well, now he's in a family that has significantly more resources. So we're going to raise him back up one way or another, right? Right. So at the community level, what you're doing with reparations, you're not just giving money to individual people. You're imbuing an entire community with something that can help it cure it of its brokenness. And so now what happens is people are interacting. The fact that people are interacting is now going to help sustain the long-term effects of reparations.
How do you deal with the inflationary effect of giving every black person who, when we speak to reparations, we're talking about black people who are descendants of slaves, for sure. How do you account for the inflationary effect that would happen by doing that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. This is one of like the concerns that people have, right? So there's a lot of different approaches to this, right? One thing you can do is you can pay it out over a longer time scale. Okay, so you don't have to suddenly give all the money all at once, right?
Right.
Another thing you can do is you can create what are called these baby bonds, which Derek Hamilton and William Darity talked about, also a lawyer during the court who I was referring to. So a baby bond is this situation where, tomorrow we decide, that reparations would be distributed to people who have identified as black in the last 10 years, for instance. And so maybe they get it. Maybe their kids, let's say their kids get it, right? And so the kids can't spend the money right away, but they have to wait until like age 18 or something like that. And so it's you create a bond, and then the bond reaches maturity by age 18, right? And so because that's happening gradually, you're giving the economy like lots of time basically
To recover.
adjust. Yeah.
Okay.
And let me say something else, bro. Do you know how much money we paid out to people during the pandemic? Basically, the estimated amount for reparations is a fraction of that. So this is, I'm just saying, this is not...
like the government can't afford it.
The government can definitely afford it.
Yeah.
There is no question. It's not saying that they will, that their priorities are to do it. And some might argue, well, the government couldn't afford to pay out the COVID cash payments either, and that's why we're seeing all this in inflation.
Yeah.
You can decide, because essentially, right, you print more money, you borrow.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of what some people would call economically irresponsible things, right? My argument, and by the way, this is why I tend not to. This is the reason for my politics. I leave my politics ambiguous, but the reason for my politics is actually not about like racism, things like that. It's actually that I prefer to support a political party that is proactive and focuses on prevention and not reaction, right? So even in the case of COVID-19, Obama had like a lot of support and funding set aside, right, he had this public health infrastructure to help protect us, right, from the possibility of a pandemic. And there's footage of this, right?
And it was slashed.
Magically
by someone.
By Donald Trump. Because I don't like to use, I don't want to pay for things that are not being used. This is exactly what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. So then you would rather just react to the problem once it gets here. But this is what happens, not just with the pandemic, it happens in terms of how we deal with crime. Are we going to just react to the crime with more police once the criminals become criminals? Or are we going to invest in their well-being when they're younger in education, right? And I can talk a lot about how that is also a crime control strategy and one that's more economically efficient. So same with the environment. We can decide to kick the can down the road as much as we want, but eventually we're, as human beings, facing the same fate if we, keep allowing human-induced climate change to run amok. What we could do instead is invest in prevention, and that's costly at first, but in the long run, it's worth it.
So a lot of your argument sounds like there's a substantial level of investment that needs to happen.
Yes.
Not just at the individual level, but the family level, not just at the family level, but the community level, not just at the community level, but the governmental level.
Yes. Without a doubt.
And it would take all hands on deck to turn it around in the shortest time period possible. I want to do a little bit of pivoting just because we've said a lot And if the viewers have stuck with us up till now, I do want to just give the opportunity so that they better understand you, because I'm coming from the lens of you're my brother.
Oh, true.
And so I understand you in a different way naturally, and so the things that you're discussing and why you're so passionate, I know, right? You are a professor at Emory University.
Yep.
You have a PhD
In public policy.
in public policy. You know, are you a billionaire? No, but you are well off. Let's put it like that, right? There are people who come from communities where later in life they become successful, and they never use any of that skill set to give back. They never use any of that skill set to reinvest into the community on any level. Don't really give it a whole lot of thought. You clearly have spent your life, right, working on solutions, thinking about problems, things that are impacting those whom you love. And there's an impact to you, but just for the sake of like what we're talking about right now, what you've said, like we come from a very blessed family. So we kind of we were allowed to bypass certain things, certain struggles that our parents took on, and then kind of sent us off to, you know, they ran so we could fly, you know, per se. So what inspired you, and what continues to inspire you to keep this passion, this desire to serve, to help your community, those who look like you, so that you know, they have a better life?
On the deepest level, what drives me is the recognition that, as you were describing, I have so much spiritual wealth that was passed down through generations. It's not monetary, but it's spiritual wealth. And what I realized after my master's program is that I've never been without love at any point in my life. From as far back as I can remember to the present day, I was always surrounded by people, and it was family at first, but eventually friends, just anyone who just decided to love me. And I can see it, I can discern that that's really what it was. And sometimes I feel I have a lot of heartbreak for the lack of love that other people have come to know. And I know that that's there because they tell me, right? And some of them are friends of mine or associates or students. And I see that lack of love as fundamentally the main cause of most of the biggest societal ills. And so I just feel like I have the responsibility as someone who doesn't even know what it's like to be without love to push it forward as much as I can in every way that I can. So that's what drives me fundamentally. I could go into more detail, you know, about Grandpa.
Please do. we have that space.
Yeah, man. Grandpa was you know, I told this story at his funeral, but you know, he was the reason that I wanted to try to be a hero for someone else, right? So he used to love to skate, you know, even in his old age, he was amazing at it. But I must have been only like 5 years old or so, because The Lion King had only just come out, and you know, that Elton John song, "Can You Feel the Love Tonight?"
Absolutely.
That's what makes me like. That's what reminds me of this moment, But so that was playing. I was afraid to skate. Like, I've never been a daredevil at all. I had a lot of fear as a kid, just in general. And but then when I held his hand, I wasn't afraid anymore because of how I looked at him. But it was more than that. It wasn't just that that he took my fear away, but he inspired me to want to be strong enough to be able to do that for someone else. And so that's, in some sense, that's really at the cornerstone of everything I do. It's like one of the brightest memories in my memory core. I would say that that's also how I was introduced to God. You know, my mom is responsible for that. You know, that was, I think you were born at this point, but I was, you know, I used to have these crazy nightmares, like really, really bad.
Yeah.
Like I said, I had a lot of fear as a kid. And a lot of people are introduced to God as this entity that's going to punish them if they don't straighten up. You know, they're going to go to hell if they don't do X, Y, and Z, or if they continue to do A, B, and C. And so there's a lot of hostility towards religion and towards the church for that reason. But I never knew that God. From as early back as I can remember, I had these night terrors and was afraid to go to sleep. It would be the daytime and I was anticipating the night. And so eventually, Mom realized, you know, this is a real problem, and she used the tools that she had at her disposal, being in church her whole life, right? And she opened up the Bible and she read certain verses to me and introduced God to me, not as this tyrant that's going to, you know, punish you if you do wrong, but as a hero, as nothing short of a hero, a means of access to absolute power over my own fear and over my life. That's what God has always been to me, and I couldn't change that if I wanted to. And so that kind of thing, looking at God in that way, then it also inspired me to not only want to stand up to my fears then and, you know, forever after, but it also made me want to also, again, be that kind of hero for someone else. So there are several, you know, things like that happened to me throughout childhood. And I've always looked at Dad in that way. Always. So yeah, man, that's the origin. That's the real me on the deepest level for sure.
That was beautiful, man. So when it's all said and done, then how would you like to be remembered?
Bro, that's a really hard question to suddenly answer.
That's all right. That's why we're here.
You know, I have thought about this before. And I used to be more egocentric and wanted to be remembered for like a lot of different things. But on a very deep level, the older I get, it's the impact that I want to have that's important to me. I don't care if people remember that I was involved in that impact. I just really want this world to become one where people are paying love forward, where people are experiencing love. And when people are experiencing love, the world will look very, very, very different. And I don't care if nobody remembers David McMillon after the fact. I mean, they won't eventually anyway. That's not what matters, right? I mean, it matters to my ego, but it's not what matters. And, you know, at least I'd also say this, like on a more surface level, because those are like very spiritual things, but I do actually connect them to the things I do sort of day to day, and my politics and things that I stand for. So on a more practical level, I also really want people to understand that, in the American context, right, that patriotism is the willingness to improve one's country and not the dogmatic denial of its bigotry. That's something that I really, really, really want to imbue in people's heads of my fellow countrymen, right? Because that's at the root of a lot of problems that we keep on, that we keep reinventing, right? We don't want to tell the truth about what's happened in America's history. We don't want to teach the ugly truth about what America has been. But if you really love the people who are here, and if you love your country, just like if you love your child, you're going to acknowledge the things that they do wrong, and you're going to correct it, right? So that's one of the things that I really want to do. And I believe that if we really experience love, we will correct it.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah, man, I want to give you your flowers before we get off of here. You know, you've been my older brother my whole life. And I really consider that a blessing, to use your words. And also, this is genuinely how I feel, man. You've been a hero for me, you know, this whole time. Seeing you set the standard in so many ways in my life, being that role model, being that person I can talk to, being that person that I can look up to. I'm forever grateful and appreciative that God put me as your younger brother. And whatever you do from here on, I am grateful that I get to see that journey. I will forever support you. I will forever love you. And I'm very, very, very grateful to call you my brother.
I love you, man.
I love you too. Hug time.
All right, let's do
do
this.
it.
Let's